fantastic to be here in this fantastic theater, in this amazing neighborhood, in this unbelievable city. I am just so happy to be here in Atlanta, in Midtown. And I think we're all here with one mission, which is to make sure that Midtown's magic keeps on growing, keeps on soaring, keeps on being all that it can possibly be. Now, if I were giving this talk in 2019 or earlier, I would begin with 2 or 3 slides which would emphasize the enduring strength of cities in the 21st century. What you're looking at is a picture of America. What I've taken is the 3,000 or so counties in the United States, and I've ordered them on the basis of their density level. Because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, cities are proximity, cities are closeness. What you can see with the blue line is the relationship between density and earnings. The densest 10th of America's counties earn about 50% more per person than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists call agglomeration economies. The fact that we become more productive when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. Now, there are many reasons for this. In the 19th century, cities benefited by having access to ports, access to railroads, and that both attracted people and then made them more productive. There are some people who think that smarter people just end up living in cities, and that's why they become more productive. But I can tell you, after 30 years of literature on this, a large part of this is just the fact that being around people enables you to do more. Enables you to buy, to sell, to learn, to cooperate, to sort of do those miraculous collaborative chains of creativity that have been powering humanity's greatest hits for thousands of years. The higher line, the red line, shows perhaps a more surprising fact, which is the relationship between density and population growth between 2000 and 2020. So whereas at the start of the 19th century, Americans were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, rather than spreading out, we're clustering in. Now, I would be particularly bullish about Atlanta because of its weather. It is a strange fact that the single strongest explanatory variable, the single variable that explains population growth over the past 150 years, above all, is just January temperature, right? Warmth means success. Now, there are many things that are boiled into that. Warmer parts of America have generally been more pro-business, and that is part of Atlanta's success. The economist Tom Holmes looked at counties on right-to-work states and non-right-to-work states on different sides of the state border. He found an enormous amount of industrial growth in the pro-business and the right-to-work sides of those lines. Atlanta is in a pro-business region, and that's really helpful. Secondly, and I'll return to that in a second, the warmer parts of America make it much easier to build, make it much easier to mass-produce housing. You can't understand why Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix have added about 1 million people per decade over the last 2 or 3 decades without understanding just how much easier it is to build here than it is, let's say, in suburban Massachusetts, where I live. But let's face it, Americans also don't like driving on ice in January, and for very good reasons, and that's another part of the equation. The relative affordability of Atlanta is shown here. So this shows over the past 40-odd years price growth in 5 great metropolitan areas. Atlanta's prices have stayed much steadier. Atlanta has remained much more affordable. And that's a great sense of the source of the region's strength. Now, of course, as you can see, over the past 10 years, Atlanta's also been growing in price. And that, of course, also reflects demand for the region. In the 18th century, Dr. Samuel Johnson, the writer of his dictionary, said that when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, because there is all in London that life can afford. Right? He was not talking about London's strength as a producing place. He was talking about London's strength as a place of joy, as a place of fun, as a place of consumption. Right? As humanity has become richer, as we've become more mobile, we've increasingly flocked to consumer cities, places that are enjoyable, places that are fun, places that we can find a great chance to share a mile or a kiss or a smile, right? Midtown is all about that, and that is one of its great strengths. It is a place for joy, for playgrounds, for pleasure. If you look at this graph, it shows you across metropolitan areas, I've grouped them again on the basis of their density level. Pretty much all of the price growth between 1996 and 2012 occurred in the densest fifth of America's metropolitan areas. This is price growth that greatly outstripped earnings growth, and it reflects the demand to be in cities as places of pleasure. As I will return to at the end of the talk, in a world of Zoom, in a world of COVID, right, the greatest strength that cities have is that they are places where people actually want to be, right? And that's ultimately what we need to invest in. That's ultimately what we need to care about. Now, these 4 slides of urban success then ran into this, ran into the reappearance of urban plague. There are demons that come with density. You heard talk about traffic congestion, high housing costs, crime. All of these are potential downsides of living close to lots of other people. But the greatest of all the demons of density is, in fact, plague, contagious disease. Just as it is easier to communicate an idea when you're next to someone, it is also easier to communicate a virus when you're next to someone. And cities are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for bacteria. Cities have been experiencing plagues for thousands and thousands of years. Our first well-documented urban plague was the plague of Athens in 430 BCE. Now, if you think about 5th century Athens, it's doing all that you could imagine you would want a city to do. An amazing economic powerhouse, an amazing cultural powerhouse, seemingly a genius on every street corner, doing miraculous things in the arts. Think about Athenian drama, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes. Think about Athenian sculpture, Athenian architecture, Athenian democracy, right? This is a city-state that brought Persia to its knees. Now, all of this success, very much occasion created by urban density, then excited the rivalry of Athens' land-based, non-urban, military neighbor, Sparta. Sparta sent a demand to Athens that it back down from the leadership of its alliance, the Delian League. Pericles, the leader of the Athenian democracy, not a man to take guff from anyone, answered in this great oration, as documented by Thucydides, that he wasn't going to back down, they were going to fight, and so the Peloponnesian War was on. Pericles had a cunning plan. He was going to send out the vastly superior Athenian fleet to harass the coastline of the Peloponnesian Peninsula and trust to Athens' stout walls to keep out the enemy warriors. Now, the walls were effective against the Spartan soldiers, but walls that keep out an enemy force may not be able to keep out a bacteria or a virus, and that's exactly what happened. Right? Some sort of disease, and we still don't know what, entered in through Athens' port of Piraeus. It laid waste to the city. Thucydides, who was there, describes a city that has run amok, in which people lived only for the day because they did not expect to see tomorrow. Perhaps 1/4 of the city's population died over a 2-year period, a death rate roughly 100 times that of COVID-19. Now, the plague of Athens did not totally destroy the city. It limped on for another 25 years in this war against Sparta. It did eventually lose, but its glory was dimmed forever. In some sense, moved from being, let's say, the New York City of the Eastern Mediterranean to being the Philadelphia, to being the New Haven, right? To being something that was far less than what it once was. Right? Disease is a real risk that cities face, and we must guard against it. Now, for most of the past 650 years, since the plague reappeared in 14th century Europe, right, cities have battled the disease, and they've battled more or less successfully with it. The 19th century was an era of proto-globalization, and so it was also an era of proto-plague, of proto-pandemic. This shows death rates in New York City over the last 200 years. During the early 19th century, the key killer was yellow fever. This is a mosquito-borne illness that emerged out of Africa, carried across the Atlantic in clipper ships, made its way up to the cities of the eastern seaboard by the late 18th century. Death rates were about 10 times that of COVID-19, so you can see about that's telling you about 25 per thousand, so that's 2.5%, 10 times COVID-19, or 1/10 that of the plague of Athens. And then you get cholera. Waterborne illness emerges in the Ganges Delta in 1819, gets carried along with the British Army, gets carried along with the Tsar's army, makes its way again across the oceans to our continent. Now, cities, despite these killers, continue to grow. What's going on? 2 things. First, cities are just unbelievably productive places in the 19th century. Right? They enabled people to find an opportunity to find some kind of future for themselves. And if your choices are dying of starvation in Ireland or coming to New York and potentially facing cholera, you're going to get on the boat. Right? You're going to take that risk because you know at least you're not going to starve in New York City. You're going to find some form of economic opportunity. But secondly, cities came together, just as we are all hoping that Midtown will come together to solve their own problems. You can see right there in 1842, the Croton Aqueduct opens. Croton Aqueduct is the sort of most important symbolic piece of infrastructure investment of the 19th century for New York City. There is nothing that paid off more for cities than investing in clean water, right? Because that clean water rid the city of cholera. These investments were enormously high. America's cities and towns were spending more on water at the start of the 20th century than the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army, right? An enormous amount of money was spent on this. But it was an investment that paid off. And you can see after 1866, after the Board of Health started forcing tenement owners to connect to the water system, that death rates started to decline. And for most of the past 100 years, we've enjoyed a blessed century where our cities became healthier than the larger country as a whole. Right? That happened because ordinary citizens came together to try and push towards this type of investment, to come together to do these joint things that are so crucial for cities to survive and to thrive. Now, in 2020, pandemic returned. It returned first in large cities, where, again, they were the ports of entry for disease, and then they spread elsewhere. This disease is unusual because it loads very heavily on education, or more precisely, the lack thereof. What I'm showing you here is total death rates from COVID-19 over the whole course of the disease, and the share of the population with a college degree. You can see Atlanta. Atlanta's in red here. It's not surprising that the slope is negative. More educated places are always healthier. What's surprising is how big the difference is between the less educated parts of America and the more educated parts of America. That's a fourfold difference between Las Vegas and San Jose. 4 times as many people are dying in the less educated parts of America than in the most educated parts of America. That's for many reasons. Right? One part is just educated people were healthier, and so their bodies were stronger when they were faced with the disease. But it's also because educated people were able to switch to Zoom. They were able to move away. They didn't have to participate in the face-to-face economy. That was a short-run health benefit, but of course the fact that Atlanta is so educated, the fact that Midtown is so educated, is part of the challenge, right? Because getting people back to work is far more difficult when they actually have a Zoom option that functions. Now, that's the challenge that we face, is the enduring emptiness of so many of our offices. This is from Castle Technology. This is not a big Atlanta thing, so we have a bunch of cities which are not Atlanta. This comes from key swipe data about people coming into their offices. And as you can see, it declined by 80% in the initial days, but as of 2 weeks ago, you're still looking at 50% vacancies. You're still looking at half of the offices that are empty. That's the problem that we have to face. And that's the data that lies behind the urban doom loop story. It's worthwhile emphasizing that Castle buildings are fancy buildings. Right? They're buildings full of particularly elite workers, and they're particularly prone to telework. Right? In May 2020, the height of teleworking, 68.9%. More than 2/3 of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely. You know what share of high school dropouts were working remotely? 5%, 1 in 20. Okay? Almost no poorly educated Americans were working remotely. And that's an important reason why it's so crucial to get our places back. Because even if the elite workers can thrive at home, right, there are no jobs for the 32% of Americans who work in the urban service sectors if the elite workers are at home. Right? There's no jobs in retail or leisure or hospitality if the elite workers are just clustering by themselves. Right? To have an America that's more equitable, to have an America that's more fair, to have an Atlanta that's more fair, right, we need to get back to the office. We need to rejuvenate our core downtown areas. This just shows that teleworking all the time has stayed steady at about 10%. I think that's very unlikely to go up from there. Teleworking some hours has actually grown over time, and it's now about 12%. Okay? And this is across all of America, so this doesn't skew towards more educated workers. Now, the urban doom loop narrative, right, has to deal with the fact that this is not the first time technology has changed cities. Right? We have thousands of years to observe the broad dance between technological change and urban areas. Some technologies are centripetal, meaning they pull us together. Some are centrifugal, meaning they push us apart. Right? The aqueduct, right, is one of the great centripetal technologies of all time. It empowers people to come together by bringing in safe water from elsewhere. The 19th century was a centripetal century in which 2 great technologies, right, one of which is rail, right, enabled the growth of great cities like Atlanta. And of course, Atlanta is a city built on rail. Right? That's why it's here. That's why it grew in the 19th and early 20th century. And rails enabled the growth of cities from Chicago to Boston to Los Angeles. Right? Rails were the linking points for our country, and cities grew up at key nodes on the network of rail lines. The other great technology in the 19th century was skyscrapers. Skyscrapers, in fact, involved two innovations, one of which is the steel frame or iron frame building, right? The second of which is the elevator, because without the elevator, you can't soar in the same way. And so these enabled cities to grow throughout the 1900s and to really blossom at the start of the 20th century. Then over the course of the 20th century, transportation costs started to plummet. This shows you the 90% drop in the cost of moving a ton a mile by rail. Okay? Huge declines in transportation costs. Declines in rail, innovations in highways, innovations in container ships, innovations in trucking, right? All of these things meant cities that were built around the older transportation technologies had lost their comparative advantage. Detroit was a fantastic place to make cars when Henry Ford got started in 1905. By 1955, it wasn't clear why you needed to have automobile production there and why you couldn't move to a place that was a lot cheaper. And so by the 1970s, when I was a kid growing up in New York City, it looked as if not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York City to drop dead. That New York had been this amazing city built around its port, built around railroads, and it spiraled in an unbelievable thing that looked very much like an urban doom loop. Right? It spiraled because of rising crime rates, because of deindustrialization, because the city couldn't pay its bills. Right? And there you can see President Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become. Now, one way to see what happened, and this is very important in sort of thinking about Atlanta and the rise of the Sun Belt, is that declining transportation costs meant that we could move from places where firms had a productive advantage, perhaps because of access to the coal mines outside of Pittsburgh or access to the Great Lakes. We could move to places where people just wanted to live. And in some sense, this is the regional version of the rise of the consumer city, the regional version of the playground region. This shows self-reported happiness in different parts of America. And as you can see, the growing areas in the South, people typically say that they're much happier than in the declining parts of the North. It turns out that they're not happy because they're growing. If you go back to the 1940s or the 1970s, these places were happier then. And in some sense, it's people leaving places like Scranton, PA, where my wife's grandfather went into a coal mine at the age of 13 and died at 59 of black lung, right? But they paid him to be there, and he managed to send two daughters through college with the money that he earned in the coal mine. But you moved out of those areas, those former production areas, into places like Atlanta, into places that were more pleasant, that were more joyful, that were places of consumption rather than production. Now, of course, our cities are also shaped by the 20th century's great transportation technology. Our modern cities are built around automobiles. Right? Cities always reflect the dominant transportation technology in the era in which they're built. Our oldest cities are built around pedestrian spaces, they're built around walking. Then our 19th century cities are built around streetcars, they're built around elevated railroads. And our 20th century cities, like Atlanta, are built around cars. Which is why thinking about how to make Midtown a little bit safer for pedestrians can be a little bit hard, because Atlanta is such a naturally car-oriented city. The rise of cars, of course, meant this great suburbanization that occurred over the course of the 20th century. In the North, cars, cheaper transportation, really killed off the urban industries. It's easy to forget now, but the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit. It was garment production in New York City. In 6 years, New York City lost 500,000 jobs in this industry, right? As cheap transportation meant that all of those jobs headed first south, and then, of course, across the oceans to places where you had cheaper labor. By the 1970s, it really looked as if New York was through. Atlanta also suffered a 1970s hiccup, but of course Atlanta suffered less, and there are a number of reasons for this. First, the city was in the right region, right? So regional growth kept it afloat despite the 20% reduction in the core population during the 1970s. Lower costs kept big corporations like Home Depot or Coca-Cola in the region. Delta, as a later city, it had less of an industrial hangover than the older cities had, so it had less of a thing to undo than Detroit. And of course, it also benefits from skills. And this is something that so many Northerners forget, but Atlanta is best seen as sort of equivalently educated to, say, Boston or Seattle, almost, right? I mean, it's a city that has lots and lots of skilled people, and that is a great sense of its strength. When I think about, right? The most dynamic parts of America. I think about those places in the Sun Belt that are pro-business and are also very highly skilled, right? Charlotte, Austin, and of course Atlanta. That is the magic of this region, and this is part of how it thrived so much during the 1970s and afterwards. But during our urban doom loop of the 1970s, there was a hypothesis that was thrown out by a futurist named Alvin Toffler, who was looking at the city in trouble, and he hypothesized that the information technology of his day, fax machines, personal computers, would kill off urban offices, would kill off the face-to-face contact that would seem to be needed in many businesses, and the cities that made that face-to-face contact possible. He's writing in 1980, and he's giving exactly the same story that we hear today, that all of this technology would make face-to-face contact absolutely obsolete. Now, the ironic thing, of course, is that for 39 of the last 44 years, he was completely and totally wrong. What happened after 1980 was not that urban offices became obsolete. It was not that face-to-face contact disappeared. It was that cities experienced an enormous renaissance. Now, this is an image of Michael Bloomberg's City Hall, which is based on Bloomberg's company, and the Wallace office that in his company is in turn based on the Solomon Brothers trading floor. When you think about trading floors, there's something of a puzzle. Here we have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in a normal industry would live like university deans, ensconced in a large office, protected by a big desk, having a secretary outside. Right? But here they are, despite all their wealth, they're sitting crammed next to each other. They're like leaning on each other, they're listening to each other, they're sweating on each other, they're getting guacamole on each other, if we believe Michael Lewis, right? They're in the midst of this messy area. Why are they doing that? Because in their industry, knowledge is vastly more important than space, because you can make millions of dollars overnight by knowing a little bit more. And that is in some sense why cities came back, because knowledge is more important than space. We have now hundreds of studies showing that globalization and technological change created a huge rise in the returns to skill, a rise in the returns to being smart, a rise in returns to innovation, and we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. Right? If technology was making face-to-face contact obsolete, then why would the most famous example of a geographic cluster in the world be Silicon Valley, the place that has access to the best technology? Why would current AI innovation be clustered in this tiny little area in San Francisco where all the firms are right next to each other if face-to-face contact has become completely irrelevant? One way of thinking about it is, as the world has become more complex, it is easier for ideas and knowledge to get lost in translation. Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your students. Right? And we have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. That's why face-to-face contact is so precious. Of course, not all cities have come back. Right? Skills are incredibly important. This is obvious both in wages. So this is something economists call human capital externalities, that if you work around skilled people, you earn more. Holding your years of schooling constant as the share of adults in your metropolitan area goes up by 10 percentage points, your earnings also go up by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant. It pays to work around skilled people. This explains why places like Seattle came back. So in 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights. Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. This is before Amazon, before Costco, before Microsoft, before Starbucks. All of these amazing entrepreneurial companies which made the Seattle that we see today emerged, and they emerged there because of Seattle's skill base. That's why Jeff Bezos decided, as he's driving across America in a station wagon, to go to Seattle, because that's where he knew he would find the skilled workers that he needed. This other image is of Boston, Cambridge, around MIT. Again, another area, declining industrial space. It totally reinvented itself, again, around skills, around ideas, around face-to-face contact. This shows population growth and skills over the past 20 years. Okay, now, when I think about the future, and I'll try and show you a few facts to try and make this case, I don't think the future is one of people living at home. I don't think it's the future of working at home. I don't think it's about all of our offices disappearing. But I do think that talent has never become more mobile. So when I think about some startup of 15 really smart people, I can't imagine they're just going to say, let's never meet with one another again. But I can imagine them saying, let's leave Silicon Valley to go to Vail because we like skiing. Let's go to Hawaii because we like surfing. Let's go to Austin, Texas because we don't like paying state income taxes. Right? All of that has become easier because you can Zoom with your venture capitalist, because you can Zoom with your accountant. That means that every region, Atlanta included, is involved in a fight over talent that has never been hotter. Now, why do I think that face-to-face contact remains important? Well, we have data from the pandemic itself that seems to suggest this. There's a famous study by the Stanford economist Nick Bloom from about 10 years ago that looked at remote work in telemarketers working for a Chinese travel agency. This is from a more recent study during the pandemic period looking at a large American retailer. Both studies find the same thing. You send call center workers home, they can make just as many calls. No loss in static productivity. But they have a 50% reduction in the probability of being promoted, right? There's a dynamic loss. What does it mean to be promoted in a call center? Well, it means your boss has figured out that you can handle tough calls. How would you learn to handle tough calls if you were alone? How would your boss learn that you were good at it if you were at home? And so, the learning channel gets turned off if we're away. This shows the decline in time spent with a boss associated with being remote versus online. And it's particularly remote versus in office, and it's particularly valuable for young people to be around other people so they can learn things that they never knew that they needed to know. Sort of remarkable things that occur when we're around people who know their business. I'm just going to read you from this. This looks at what happened to Microsoft's network when they sent everyone home. Our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed with fewer bridges between disparate parts. Furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. Okay, so a breakdown of connectivity. This is from the work of Jose Ramon Morales-Aria and Carlos de Abuin. On the left-hand side, you can see jobs that had to be done live, the non-remotable jobs. These were jobs that experienced a drop in employment early on, and then it came back, and a drop in new postings early on. So new postings, these are sort of, postings are like wanted ads online. It's from a large aggregator. By contrast, look at the right side. These are remotable jobs. Employment stayed steady, and Microsoft didn't fire their programmers, but the demand for new programmers dropped by 40%, right? And it stayed down for 2 years. Firms were not willing to onboard new workers nearly as much. Again, it's because the learning channel was turned off. And of course, we now have scores of study on the effect of remote learning in our schools, which is somewhere between catastrophic and disastrous, right? We cannot teach kids when they're not in the classroom. I've also engaged in a bunch of measuring of winners and losers since COVID. We're using changes in wages, changes in employment, changes in permitting, changes in prices. January temperature, again, is very powerful. So this is January temperature and employment growth, right? Much more employment growth in the warmer places. This is January temperature and earnings growth. So both employment and earnings are going up more in warmer parts of America. This again shows the enduring dynamism of the Sun Belt. And Atlanta is doing sort of exactly as well as you would expect its temperature to do. If you look at housing prices have gone up much less in the most skilled parts of America, which again reflects this sort of shift to remote work in places like San Francisco. Atlanta is doing above the curve here. So Atlanta is actually doing well in terms of housing prices. This is where Atlanta is in the top 50, so it's about 12 in the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the US. It's sort of in the top quarter, but it's not at the very top, right? Which is, I think, a great place for you to be, probably room for some improvement, but certainly if you compare it to the bottom half, San Francisco is at the absolute nadir of this group, but Boston is also in the bottom half. Atlanta is showing a lot more strength and a lot more resilience in response to this. Okay, in my last minute and a half, I want to sort of give what I think is crucial going forward. So in some sense, the consumer city is the anchor for Midtown, right? It has to be a place of fun. It has to be a place of joy. It has to be a place where people want to live, because people can work anywhere now. Okay, first of all, start with a view of planning that throws out Corbusier and throws out top-down and recognizes that the genius of cities comes from the ground up. It comes from ordinary entrepreneurs. It comes from ordinary companies. It comes from ordinary builders, right? And so we have to embrace the disordered nature of great urban spaces. Second, one of the curses of over-regulating our spaces has been the separation of uses. And the cities that are plagued with these really vast centers of offices, Chicago, New York, right, are the places that are facing the biggest troubles today. By contrast, a great asset of Midtown is the growth of its residential space over the last 25 years. This must continue. This is going to be the saving grace of this area, is the fact that it's not just a place for offices, it's a place for people to live. in part because people will go into the office more if they live close to it, in part because when things happen as they do, it's easier to have lots of different uses going around so you can maintain demand for urban space. Empowering urban entrepreneurs. So I talked about the importance of skills for urban success. Most skills are not just that are learned in school, they're the ones that are learned on the street corner, they're the ones that are learned at the water cooler. Right? And there's no skill that's more important for the long-run resilience of a place than the talent and inclination to be an entrepreneur. This just shows over here the relationship between one of our measures of entrepreneurship, average firm size, and subsequent employment growth. Small firms, skilled people, and connections to the outside world are the ultimate source of urban strength in the 21st century. We need urban entrepreneurs not just because they bring economic vitality, but because they're fun. And these are food trucks, which are one example of the type of urban entrepreneurship that can bring joy to a place. Cities don't necessarily know how to make entrepreneurs, but they do know how to kill it. And if I'm going to sort of embrace one simple thing, it's going to be faster permitting for the entrepreneurs of the world. It is outrageous that we enable the entrepreneurship of the rich in this country so much more than we enable the entrepreneurship of the poor. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, you can have 1 billion users before any regulator knows you exist. If you want to start a deli, if you want to start a bodega 5 blocks away, you literally have 18 permits to get before you can open your doors. Right? This needs to change, and even Atlanta, which is much better than Boston, has room to improve in terms of just making it really easy for any business owner to get started and to change their space. Public safety is not optional. I think one of the things which has made me saddest over the last 3 years has been the view that the police are optional. They're not optional. We cannot defund the police. Yes, we can ask our police to do more. We can ask them to treat every citizen with kindness and courtesy. That's entirely reasonable. But if we want more from our police, we have to spend more on our police. We cannot defund them, because defund them is just a recipe towards utter urban chaos. Shared spaces. And this is where we get down to this great organization that we're here celebrating today. Right? There are 2 parts of shared spaces that are really important. One of which is the programming part. Right? That's the fun part. That's the urban dancing. That's the urban festivals. That's the urban connection that can be programmed. But there's also the downside, fighting against vacancies. Every individual landlord has an incentive to keep their property vacant a little bit longer just in case a whale shows up who's willing to pay top dollar. But if we all do that, we lay low the region. Right? And it's really important that we sort of have a push to bring as many storefronts open as we possibly can, to bring as much energy back as we possibly can to Midtown. And I'll just end with two other slides. One of which is, don't be confused. This is a tough time for cities, but this is not an existential threat. We will get through this. We have been through much worse. The 70s were worse, and indeed, the 1940s were worse. Right? This is Milan in 1943, a city that was leveled by Allied bombing. Right? Milan has been for the last 20 years a capital of the information age, a glittering city. I could have shown you images of London that would have looked roughly the same. Cities are resilient because they play to our greatest assets as a species. Right? On our own, we are flimsy creatures, not able to fight off a single black bear for most of us. Together, we work miraculous things. We work miraculous things because we learn from each other, because we connect with one another, because we innovate collaboratively. Right? This is what cities make possible. This is why the work of the Midtown Alliance is so important, and this is why I thank all of you for being involved in making this neighborhood, in making this city, in making this region great, and let's just keep on fighting for the cities that empower humanity. Thank you very much.